Well, hi, folks. This is Roger Horowitz. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Library. And more importantly, today I'm bringing you another Hagley History Hangout interview. Hagley History Hangout is where we emphasize and bring to the public knowledge the kind of great work being done in Hagley's collections. And we talk to scholars who have done research grants through us and have written books using our materials there. So that's what we're doing here today. And today, I'm very pleased to be with María Otero-Cleves, who's written a wonderful book about consumption in Colombia. Anna, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Anna currently is a lecturer in the history of Latin America at York University. She spent time at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, where she was associate professor. She has a PhD from Oxford University. She's done coursework both as BA and MA in Latin America and in London. Sorry, UK. So she goes back and forth between these two countries in her career. But she's here with us today. So Anna, the book we're talking about is your first book and your new book, Plebeian Consumers, Global Connections, Local Trade, and Foreign Goods in 19th-Century Colombia, Cambridge University Press. Congrats on having the book out there. Tell me, what inspired you to write this book? What brought this to light?
Well, that's such a good question. It's quite a long story, of which I hope I can give you a short answer. Um, as you already mentioned briefly, I in my book, which is my first book, I tell the story of how what I understand as plebeian consumers, that is peasants, day workers, market women, former slaves, among many other popular sectors, became the largest consumers of foreign commodities in 19th century Colombia, and as such, I think dynamic participants of a highly connected world. When I started my research, which to be honest was way back over a decade ago, consumption was a topic that was rarely touched upon by Colombian historians of the 19th century. And I have to be honest, I think Latin American historians of 19th century history as well, they were not very keen or not focused particularly on consumption. If consumers were ever mentioned by that historiography, it was mostly to underline the upper class's desire for luxury goods. So I ended up working first on luxury commodities. I generally you find these very common anecdotes of, for instance, stories of very expensive pianos being transported across the mountains, the Andean mountains to Bogota, which is the capital city, in the backs of human carriers of mules in order to reach these upper classes that like conspicuous consumption. In these stories, however, the popular sectors were rarely mentioned, and if they were mentioned, they were generally uh, as passive consumers, as passive receptors of these very important global changes. So this interpretation also came at a time when there was a very common narrative about Colombia being a very isolated country with a very fragmented national market. And also a perspective of Latin America mostly as a provider of raw materials, meaning, as you know, economic history, the history of coffee, bananas, tobacco, silver, you mentioned it, but not necessarily what came in exchange of those commodities. So my question was particularly, okay, we send all this amount of, I don't know, tobacco or coffee in exchange for what? Um, so when I turned to the archives, I kind of realized that I had to tell a very different story uh, that emerged by following the commodities, following cotton goods, machetes, patent medicines, canned food, you name it, like so many commodities that came into Colombia in the second half of the 19th century. And drawing on my training as a cultural historian, I set up to explore those commodities, how they circulated throughout the national territory, but with a keen interest of seeing how it changed the everyday life of the popular sectors. And that's why I ended up focusing particularly on the popular sectors, but also on a great range of commodities, because generally when you work on consumption, a very good strategy is to focus just in one commodity. For example, cotton textiles. But I came to realize that it was such a variety of commodities that I decided to divide my narrative by commodities and follow each good throughout the national territory.
Great. Chains and consumption patterns and all that. Great. Well, you emphasize just in what you said, how much is about Colombia, but in your title, you've got a lot of other words about, and you talk in your book a lot about the nature of peripheral economies, nature of the world economy, and all that. How much are you writing a book that could be called more a history of capitalism, a history of the way capitalism emerges?
That's a fantastic question. I think I'm very glad that you're asking me that question, because for me it was a project that it was certainly not just about Colombia. I think there's a shift on how we can tell histories of capitalism from for what we can call the periphery. So what I wanted to is it was also to tell a kind of a history of global connections of
Hmm.
how they are constructed from the margins, and how the margins, meaning a country like Colombia has the capacity to transform, shape, and nudge global processes from below. In that sense, I believe it's both a local and a global story. Um, and to be honest, it was partly because I faced the archive and realized that by following the commodities, I was going to encounter a lot of characters that were not just Colombians. So I'm going to give you a few examples, like a very broad cast of characters. This includes, for example, manufacturers in Manchester carefully tailoring and designing cotton textiles to satisfy Colombians' demands, commercial agents in Connecticut taking orders for shipment to the Colombian Pacific coast, merchants in seaports in Colombia receiving the merchandise to be sold after in the marketplace or in market fairs, and of course peasants and other popular men and women from the popular sectors, buying their most prized commodities in shops and small tiendas, as we call it, in exchange not only for money but mostly from other goods, from coffee, rubber, and even from labor. I have sources of people working, for example, a week in order to pay for a piece of cotton textile, which is fantastic. So it was this very wide broad of characters that were telling me a story that was definitely not only local, that involved a great range of people across the Atlantic. And in that sense, I wanted to position it in Colombia, but kind of as a methodological bet to tell a history from capitalism from the periphery, as a way kind of questioning how, despite the fact that they didn't have, like consumers didn't have absolute freedom to determine the kind of the pace and the rhythms of these new commercial exchanges, they were nevertheless very, very important to at least nudge or change or challenge certain dynamics and flows of that global market.
Well, one thing which is nice in what you just said is the way that the import of commodities for the popular classes is linked to the export of, you say, of big goods, that in order to pay for these things, these commodities that were coming in, and also to be paid for the things that they were sending out, these commodities were an important piece of that exchange.
Exactly. And even in the collection that we're going to talk about it a little bit further, I found how they're paying for machetes, or they're paying for textiles in exchange of rubber or coffee. Um, so it's a very dynamic, but a more, I think it invites us to see consumption in a more open concept of what consumption means in the 19th century, not just goods for money, but all the characters and types of exchanges and dynamics that that kind of trade needs uh, for taking hold in Latin America in the 19th century.
It's also a different way of looking at money, where monetary supply is usually a big issue here, but here you don't have a whole lot of hard currency or ability, of course, to exchange dollars for Colombian pesos. So money is also the goods.
Exactly. Exactly. So this, because that's kind of the first question that my students ask me when I teach classes about foreign trade in 19th century Colombia. It's we have this very limited understanding of goods for money, and the 19th century was such a different world in terms of exchanges. It's not just pesos, or you find pounds circulating US dollars as well, but many other commodities that are used to pay for other goods.
Right. Well, that's great. Well, you emphasize, if you will, so just now the sort of the formative characteristics of this exchange there. And so there's a lot of, I have to say, Fernand Braudel in that. I have my students read Braudel because that's a place where a lot of things start there. But one thing you do, which is I really reminded me of Braudel, is you look a lot at these fairs and markets and these, if you will, non-permanent places of exchange in a lot of towns. Tell me about these, the kind of role these play in your story and in the markets that you describe.
Well, markets and fairs are such an important part of the book, in particular because I think I see these spaces not merely as containers of economic transactions, but as nodes of complex social processes
Mhm.
and creators of cultural and political activity. Just as you very rightly note, it's very similar to the approximation of Brudel's, where the market towns act as hubs of production, exchange, and no less important, the circulation, for example, of ideas. In other words, I see markets and fairs in the 19th century in Colombia as places where people did so much more than just sell and buy goods. Um, they talk about politics in the marketplace. They negotiated their place in the republic in the marketplace. They sought social and political recognitions from their peers in those spaces. They recognize each other as citizens of a republic in the marketplace as well as many other like dynamics at their place. So for me, the marketplace is kind of the theater of exchange at the same time that is the theater of everyday practices of economic life.
Yeah, that sounds Brodelian to me.
Very much so.
But one difference is it seems that Brodel talks about how those essentially fade in early modern, and your markets seem to persist throughout your story. They don't go away.
They don't go away, and I think they do allow me to kind of challenge a narrative of the fragmentation of the Colombian national market. Because if you kind of understand how the commodities reach those fairs, you start seeing, if you draw a map of Colombia, you start seeing how the regions started to get connected, how people actually from very far away recognize each other in the marketplace. So I see them as kind of supporting this idea of the new republic, of building this new body politic in which people engage with each other from very different parts of the country in the marketplace. I see actually in the 19th century such an important character of the story, not just my popular consumers, but also the spaces in which that activity takes place.
Well, in a way, that's where the nation forms, is through that. This is the interaction between people who are in widely scattered settlements interact through commodities and through exchange.
Which is it's very connected to the idea of political economy at the time, right? The marketplace is seen as the place where people interact socially and therefore, I'm using quotes here, become more civilized and therefore
Mm.
they can guarantee the progress of the national unity, which I think is what the elites were actually claiming in their texts and in the press. This idea that they needed to build a nation not only through politics, but through political economy as
Mm.
well. It's such an important part of the Republican project, not only in Colombia, in Latin America as a whole, because the idea of the marketplace as a place not only of exchange, but of building good citizens, it's paramount in the 19th century.
Well, if these are the nodes, if you will, let's talk about some of the goods that move through those nodes. Let's start with textiles, which of course is one of the big commodities throughout in the emergence of capitalism and all that, and plays a huge part in your story. Talk about that if you would.
Well, I think textiles are fantastic. In great part, I think I started with textiles as the first commodity I analyzed in the book is because I think at some point, at least 80% of the imports to Colombia were textiles, mostly provided by Britain. At the time, as you all know, the world's main provider of cotton textiles. So I started with textiles because it was such a huge percentage of the imports that Colombia received at the time. Um, and I started to kind of understand the dynamics around textiles. I came to realize that cotton textiles were manufactured across the Atlantic according to the preferences of consumers across the country. Particularly not only just the Colombian popular consumers, but manufacturers in Manchester, for example, were very keen to adapt their production according to the tastes of people in Medellin, making kind of a different design for them, people from Medellin, from that of Cartagena or from Barranquilla. So they were very careful to accommodate to the different tastes depending on the region, not just Colombia. I also find, for example, sources of US consuls complaining at the end of the 19th century, trying to understand why US manufacturers had not learned to adapt to the necessities and the demands of local consumers, and why Colombians were still buying textiles from Manchester if, I don't know, New York was closer to Colombia. And one of the things I explained is that they were able to respond and adapt to the colors, design, sizes of the commodities that Colombian consumers were demanding. Even if they were poor, they knew what they wanted. And I think one of the things that guaranteed Britain's dominance of the import market in Colombia was that they had this very good ability to adapt. And to be fair, something that has been shown by the historiography is because they had so much expertise in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
If you see what they accomplished in India, even before reaching the Colombian market in the 19th century, all the experience they had in Africa as well to accommodate to specific needs of specific places, guarantee that they maintain their share of the market, right? So I think it's a very interesting take of recognizing that it's not just an imposition of these are the commodities that you want to consume and that you're going to consume because we say so.
Hmm.
And it's a very different story. It's a story that shows that popular demands and the preference of popular sectors were taken seriously and play a great role in determining the rhythms and the patterns of trade in the 19th century.
Well, it's saying that you build a lot on Giorgio Riello's book, Cotton, and especially his use of material culture. How much does material culture figure into your analysis of this cotton and of other pieces of these commodity stories?
That's a fantastic question because I think for me, when I started working on this project, I started as a cultural historian working on material culture. So for me, it was not only about trade and exchange, it was also about the commodities themselves, the size, how they felt, their colors, their dimensions, this very important connection between people and things, and how culture is constructed through that, through the exchange between commodities among people. So for me, material culture was paramount in the whole analysis of very different commodities. Besides cottons, I also reach a very important commodity that are machetes. I generally mispronounce it in English. In Spanish are called machetes, which are still so important in Colombia. I think Colombia today is the first producer of machetes currently. In the 19th century, the story was another story because they had to import the machetes for the Colombian marketplace. And machetes, to be honest, ended up being also a very important part of my book because they tell us a different story than cotton textiles does. And this is because most of the machetes came from a small factory in Connecticut called the Collins Company that started to recognize that producing machetes and access for the Latin American market was the way to go.
Let me
Uh,
try. This is an amazing story here, because here you've got this, okay, textiles from Manchester, we can understand that, the time of the world and all that. That kind of makes sense. And of course, Manchester is sending textiles all over the world, as you say, and as Riello documents. Okay, but machetes and Collins machetes from this one place in Connecticut, that's not what you'd expect. I mean, how does this happen that these Collins machetes become, if you will, the Kleenex, if you will, the Xerox, the standard for the machetes there.
Absolutely. And I love your reference to the clinics because I think when you refer to machete, generally we say El Collins. It's kind of the brand is you already know what you're getting. It was recognized in Spanish. If you follow the dictionaries in Spanish in the 19th century, they define the Collins within the dictionary, and then they give us the meaning of El Collins, a machete made by the American brand Collins. So that means that it was highly popular in Latin America. I think they were very smart in the way they recognized that the Latin American market was the market to adapt to. Um, and the Collins Company, what they did is that they started to send company officials to Latin America, and this is not just Colombia. I have consuls from the US giving reports in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, you name it, kind of explaining why the Collins was the tool to buy, and why peasants preferred that tool because it didn't break, and that they were not easily tricked to buy European brands in exchange of the Collins, regardless of the fact that the Collins was a little bit more expensive than other brands. So I came to like the conclusion that they became very expert consumers. They knew what they were buying. The Collins Company was also fantastic in the sense that they were very open to receive contributions of suggestions regarding the design of the tool, to the extent that the design based on the number one design of the machetes in the Collins Company is based on a sketch sent from Cuba to the Collins Company, showing that they had to change the shape of the machetes. So you do see the company kind of adapting depending on the uses of the machetes. It's very different to use a machete for coffee, um, for growing coffee than to cutting cane, right? So they were very keen on adapting to the Latin American markets. And the other thing, this is one of the side of the story, right? The company adapting. But the other thing that is very important, particularly for Colombia, is that you are in a very agricultural country, not necessarily very rich, in which this tool is going to be very versatile and kind of universal in the sense that it's going to replace other agricultural tools. So if you have to buy an agricultural tool, you are going to buy a machete. And that ended up being part of everyday life of the popular sectors. They started incorporating them in many things, not only for, I don't know, expanding the agricultural frontier, but also for traveling around the territory. To this day, there's certain places in Colombia that you do have to have a machete in order to travel around the country. Machetes were also, for example, very important to defend one's honor, uh, to fight in civil wars, to the extent that there were laws that prohibited importing machetes during time of civil unrest in Colombia. So this tool became to be kind of universal. It was everywhere. And it became, not surprisingly, part of the popular sector's identity to this day, I have to say.
Well, this verges into your point about the politics of it, how these aspects of popular consumption also have a political dimension as well. And you emphasize it especially with the machete. What makes it political, or how is it part of it? Actually, let me say differently. What makes it constitutive of citizenship in this nation?
Um, yes, they're definitely connected to citizenship. I think one of the things after reading a lot of primary sources and trying to understand what machetes meant to the popular sectors, um, I recognize that they had and they play an extensive role in shaping citizenship on the ground, as I call it in the book, right? From the ground up. And I started to compare what they might have meant for the upper classes and what they have meant for the popular sectors. So seen from the vantage point of the country's upper classes, this agricultural tool allowed many people to become productive citizens, as the imported good became indispensable for the expansion of the agricultural frontier, developing the country's export economy, and as we already mentioned, integrating Colombia into a national and global market. Machetes were also seen as tools that allowed the popular sector to recognize the national territory by making it possible to travel throughout the Republic and also form an idea of a shared political community, which we already have touched upon. However, I think for the popular sectors, the machete carried a distinct political meaning that found expression in the way the tool was used and wielded. I'm going to give you a few examples. For peasants, the machetes were needed not only and settlers in particular, colonos as we call them in Spanish, to cultivate new crops and open the agricultural frontier, but also at the same time to defend their property rights. Although they did went to the courts to ask for their property to be protected, machetes were also wielded to assert the rights over their property and the fruit of their labor. For other members of the popular sectors, using the machete meant to bargain over the limits of their freedom, and particularly their independence. Bogas, which are rivermen from the Magdalena River, for example, use the machete to keep working independently and to defend their economic independence. So I think that's part of the reasons, like, okay, if I'm going to be part of the Republic, I want to be independent. I don't want to be co-opted into the labor force. But I think the most telling example is the use of machetes by Afro-descendants in the Cauca region, that is in southwestern Colombia, as a part to negotiate with the Liberal Party their political participation within the Republic, as a way of being part of the National Guards with their machetes in their waist, defend the liberal cause in exchange of land, the abolition of slavery, the end of monopolies of aguardiente, among many other things. So I think that's kind of the tension I want to tell in the book, right? This idea of the elites of seeing popular consumers as productive citizens, of people that if they want more necessities, therefore they're going to work harder and become better citizens of the new republic. And on the other hand, popular consumers with their own interests and demands, using the machete and many other commodities as a way to build their political identity and demand the presence in the republic. So it ended up being a very interesting take on how material culture can tell us a lot about politics as well as political economy, which I think we tend to divide it way too much in the analysis. And I think to understand the 19th century, political economy is such a key concept and not just political participation.
And of course, it's the Collins machete, which is that's just the great story. Well, okay, so we got clothing, textiles, clothing, fabrics, and all that. Obviously important. Machetes, it's very clear it's important. But you also talk a lot about commodities which, on their face, might not seem important, especially patent medicines. And you do a wonderful section about Florida water. It's a wonderful story there. What is Florida water, first of all? It's not just water from Florida. That's, you know, different story. But also, how does it assume a place in popular consumption practices?
The story of Florida water is fantastic because this is still used today in Latin America. It's a commodity that still circulates. Florida water is a U.S. cologne um, produced in the 19th century by the US-based company Landman and Kemp, which Hanley Museum has the archives. It was one of the many products sold by the company. Landman and Kemp was based in New York, and they sold, among besides Florida water, which was used by the popular class as a perfume, as a cologne. They also sold tons of patent medicines. You name whatever you want, like for hair, for losing weight, for blood purifiers, among many other patent medicines. And what I find very interesting in Colombia is that through following these commodities, and particular Florida water, you kind of realize that people use their goods according to their necessity and what they want. It's not this idea that they're going to use it exactly for them, the reason they were produced for. So you will find a lot of sectors of the popular classes using it for festivities, for praying to the Virgin Mary, for curing diseases, among many other things. It has a very wide variety of uses. I also find, for example, indigenous communities using them for spiritual celebrations. So you kind of got this commodity that is imported, that it was supposed to be used just as a cologne, but it's transformed through the use in Colombia. And I landed in this commodity particularly because of the Landman and Kemp company, which sold commodities to Latin America throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century.
Well, London and Kent, they also source materials from Colombia, as I recall, and other places. Can you trace that through the company records?
The company records were, I think when I went to the company records, which are held at Hanley, I was expecting only orders of commodities, and particularly only orders of Florida water and patent medicines. And there ended up being such a beautiful source for understanding the world of goods, to be honest. I think that's a very good definition. The correspondence is really beautiful. I found boxes and boxes of letters from Colombian merchants of every single town and city you can imagine, because I was also expecting just finding, I don't know, merchants from Bogota, Medellin, and Cartagena, which are kind of the primary cities at the time. But then I just realized that there were 40 boxes with correspondence from all over Colombia, Ocaña, Tumaco, Tucres, places that I never imagined that were connected directly to a foreign company. So that allowed me to show the amount of connections that were there. But the other thing that was absolutely amazing, and not being a business historian at first, but a cultural historian, is that I found that those letters are not talking just about business. They're talking about everything. They talk about politics. They talk about their families. They talk about what they want, what the future holds. Some of the merchants attached to the correspondent photographs in order to kind of introduce themselves to the company and ask in exchange a photo from Laman and Kemp, so they can meet each other, which I find it's so telling about the world they live in. And I also find a lot about consumers. One of the challenges of writing history of consumption and consumers is that rarely leave traces of what they thought about a commodity. But in this correspondence, because there are merchants in Colombia telling the company what they want and need, they give us such good description of their customers and their consumers that you also find descriptions of how poor the consumers were, if they knew, for example, how to write and read, what were their politics, among many other things. So for me, it was such an excellent way to get closer to the people, kind of human beings, to give them names and understand the sensibilities as a very good window into their world. I think a while ago, a professor of mine told me that a good way to understand the time period that you're studying is to read newspapers, like very, very orderly and disciplined. And I just realized that by reading the correspondence I found of merchants in Colombia from, I think I follow at least 5 or 6 decades, the same merchant throughout the second half of the 19th century. I came to understand a little bit more about their world and the way they perceive themselves in the world, what they could do, what they wanted to engage, among many other things. So it was not just about trade. It ended up such a beautiful, beautiful entrance into a wider story, um, which I appreciate a lot. I think I'd spent hours and hours in that archive, just following their stories, understanding the connections. And I thought also it was beautiful to see small merchants in Colombia like corresponding directly to the foreign company. Not these ideas that they needed these huge intermediaries in order to engage in international trade. They were very agile and very like, yeah, I don't know, how can I say it? Like, yeah, very keen in promoting those kind of connections, which I find absolutely amazing.
Well, a side note about that collection, I remember when we were considering taking it in at Hagley, and one of the people we asked whose opinion about it was Susan Strasser, who, as you might know, is a historian of consumption. She's retired now, but she really broke this out in the 80s and all that. So I'll just say the presence of that collection reflects in part the influence of Susan Strasser on what we considered important and worth keeping. And so when she saw the correspondence files, I remember her saying, "You want this material because those correspondence files are so rare and so special."
I really don't have words to describe it. I think it was one of the most beautiful archives I engaged throughout my studies of consumption. And also that you mentioned material culture. People that are interested in paper correspondence, kind of the format of correspondence, it's also very important. The material collection is so beautiful as well. The type of purpose, the format, how they write, the language they use. I found, for example, this is one of my favorite sources ever. It's a letter and of a merchant writing to Laman and Kemp, and you see in red, written on the margins, write to him affectionately, kind of suggesting how you should reply to the merchant. You have to be affectionate in the way you reply to Colombian merchants. So in the margins, you find these such amazing tiny fragmented stories that allow you to reconstruct a world that is not just about trade and consumption, it's about so many other things.
Interpersonal connections in that time period. The picture
And,
is a great story.
and connection. No, the picture is to die for.
Well, I mean, that's why you all should read this book. You maybe you can't read a Lamb and Kemp collection because you don't read Spanish, but you could read Maria's Anna's take on this material. Anna, it's a great story. Do you have any hints for us what you might be thinking of in the future to work on?
Yes, I'm actually working on a second project. It's kind of it builds on my first book, but as I already told you, I'm obsessed with annotations in the margins. And I was taking a look at a ledger of a shopkeeper in Medellin in 1858, if I'm not mistaken. And in the ledger, he writes the name of the consumer and his or her profession in parentheses. And I found a woman called Maria Flores, and in parentheses it says former slave of Maestro Flores. Um, and I know that the textiles she was buying were manufactured in Manchester. So my idea is I'm working on a micro history of capitalism, once again challenging this idea of how we can tell very different stories of of capitalism from the margins. I'm most uncertain that Maria never left Rio Negro and Medellin, but I think of her as a global
Hmm.
actor. And I want to challenge that idea of how to tell different stories, human stories as well, from the periphery. The other thing that I know at this point is that those textiles were manufactured with cotton produced in the United States. So it's this
Hmm.
very interesting connection between the US, Europe, and Colombia through one commodity and one person that is Maria. So that's kind of what I want to work. This idea of challenging microhistories of capitalism, trying to understand them better from what we can call the periphery or the margin.
That was fabulous. I'll look forward to that. Uh, Thank you so much for talking with us.
Well,
And,
thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
and to all of you, stay tuned for more of our Hagley History Hangouts and conversations with the wonderful scholars who've done research at Hagley. Thank you all.